In 1882, a night watchman named Samuel Crawford descended into the basement holding cell of the Cumberland County Jail in Portland, Maine. There, he came face to face with something that would scar him for the rest of his life. A man, or at least, what resembled one. Except this prisoner was 9 feet tall, possessed bones thicker than railroad ties, and spoke in a tongue that sounded as though it hailed from a civilization that had no right to exist. Official records state that Crawford went insane 3 weeks later. They claim he began ranting about lost empires, stolen histories, and giants who constructed the world long before we arrived. They say he perished in an asylum, clutching a journal filled with symbols that no linguist could decipher. But here's what those same records conveniently omit. Crawford was not the only guard assigned to that cell. There were 4 others, and within 6 months of the giant's capture, all 5 of them were dead. Heart attacks, suicides, accidents, all between the ages of 28 and 35. All in perfect health prior to their assignment. The giant's name was never recorded. His crime was never documented, and the cell he occupied was bricked over and sealed in 1883, a year after his arrival. If you visit that jail today, now converted into a museum, there's a storage room in the basement that no one speaks of. The foundation there is 3 feet thicker than anywhere else in the building. If you ask why, the staff will tell you it's for structural reinforcement. They're lying. Samuel Crawford was born in 1851 in a small fishing village outside Portland. His father worked the docks. His mother passed away when he was 7. By the time he reached 25, Crawford had labored as a fisherman, a dock loader, and briefly as a deputy sheriff before taking the night guard position at Cumberland County Jail in 1880. He was known as dependable, reserved, and thoroughly unremarkable. The sort of man who showed up, performed his duties, and returned home without complaint. Nothing in his past suggested he would become the custodian of a secret that governments would spend decades trying to suppress. The giant arrived on a Tuesday night in March of 1882. No trial, no arraignment, no paperwork filed with the county clerk. Just a closed carriage, 6 armed federal marshals, and instructions that the prisoner was to be held in the deepest cell available, with no contact beyond the assigned guard rotation. The warden at the time, a man named Tobias Merrick, wrote in his personal diary that the marshals refused to explain the charges. They refused to provide a name. They simply stated that the prisoner was dangerous and that absolute discretion was required. Merrick assigned Crawford to the first overnight shift. Crawford's own journal, recovered from his belongings after his death and kept by his surviving sister until 1954, describes what happened that first night. The entry is dated March 14, 1882. He wrote that he descended the stairs to the basement holding area just after midnight, carrying a lamp and a meal tray as instructed. The cell was at the far end of a stone corridor that had been used for solitary confinement since the jail's construction in 1820. The walls were granite. The door was reinforced iron, with a small barred window at eye level. Crawford wrote that he approached the door expecting to see an ordinary prisoner. What he saw instead made him drop the tray. The figure inside the cell was sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall. His head nearly touched the ceiling even while seated. His shoulders were broader than the width of the cot provided. His hands, resting on his knees, were the size of dinner plates, but it wasn't the size that froze Crawford in place. It was the eyes. He described them as pale gray, almost silver, with a depth that felt like peering into a well that had no bottom. The giant didn't move, didn't speak, just watched Crawford with an expression that the guard described as unbearably sad. Crawford retrieved the tray, slid it through the feeding slot, and returned upstairs without a word. He told the warden the prisoner was secure. He didn't mention the size. He didn't mention the eyes. He went home that morning and didn't sleep. The second night, Crawford brought it a second lamp. He wanted to see the prisoner more clearly, to convince himself that exhaustion or shadows had played tricks on him. But the light only confirmed what he'd seen. The giant was real. His clothes were strange, woven from a material Crawford couldn't identify. Thick, almost like canvas, but with a sheen that suggested something finer. The stitching was precise, geometric, unlike anything Crawford had seen in a tailor shop or general store. Crawford asked the giant his name. The giant didn't respond. Crawford asked what language he spoke. Still nothing. Crawford asked why he was here. The giant finally moved. He stood, and when he did, Crawford's lamp flickered, as if the air pressure in the room had changed. The giant walked to the bars. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone who knew that speed would be interpreted as aggression. He stopped 2 feet from the door and looked down at Crawford. Then he spoke. The words were guttural, rolling with consonants that seemed to come from the back of the throat, and vowels that sounded like wind through stone. Crawford wrote that it sounded like Latin mixed with something older, something that made his teeth ache. Crawford didn't understand a single word, but the giant's tone was clear. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was pleading. On the third night, Crawford brought a notebook. If he couldn't understand the words, maybe he could learn the sounds. Maybe he could find someone who recognized the language. He sat outside the cell for an hour, writing phonetically as the giant spoke. The giant seemed to understand what Crawford was trying to do, because he repeated phrases slowly, pausing between each one as if teaching a child. By the end of the week, Crawford had filled 20 pages. He showed them to a linguistics professor at Bowdoin College, a man named Dr. Howard Fielding, who had studied ancient languages and dead dialects for 30 years. Fielding looked at the transcriptions for less than 5 minutes before handing them back. He told Crawford the sounds resembled Proto-Indo-European root structures, but with phonetic patterns that shouldn't exist in any known language family. He asked where Crawford had heard these sounds. Crawford lied and said he'd overheard immigrant dock workers. Fielding didn't believe him. He told Crawford that if this language was real, it predated recorded human civilization by at least 2,000 years. He also told Crawford to stop asking questions about it. Crawford didn't stop. He went back to the cell every night, and slowly, through gestures, drawings, and repetition, he began to understand. The giant's name, as close as Crawford could phonetically translate it, was Etha. He said he was not alone. There were others like him scattered across the continent, hidden in places that the new settlers would never think to look. Mountains, caves, underground chambers built by hands that were never supposed to be forgotten. Etha said he had been captured while trying to retrieve something from a building in Boston. He wouldn't say what. He wouldn't say why. But he told Crawford that the building used to be something else. That beneath the foundation of the bank that stood there in 1882, there were walls made of stone blocks weighing 30 tons each. Walls that were already ancient when the first European ships arrived. Crawford asked who built those walls. Etha's answer, according to the journal, was simple. We did. By the 4th week, Crawford had stopped sleeping more than a few hours a day. His sister, Emily, who lived with him, noted that he had lost weight and was talking to himself. She found pages of drawings hidden under his mattress, diagrams of buildings with impossible geometries, sketches of symbols that looked like a fusion of Sanskrit, Celtic knots, and something entirely alien, notes about architectural techniques that shouldn't have been possible without modern machinery. Emily confronted him. Crawford broke down. He told her about the giant. He told her about the language. He told her that the prisoner had drawn him a map using charcoal on the cell floor, showing the locations of other structures buried beneath American cities. New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. All of them built on top of something older. All of them hiding foundations that were never supposed to be found. Emily begged him to stop going to the jail. Crawford refused. He said Etha was teaching him something that the world needed to know. On April 9, 1882, 26 days after the giant's arrival, Crawford arrived for his shift and found the cell empty. The door was still locked. The bars were intact, but Etha was gone. The only thing left behind was a symbol burned into the stone floor. A circle with radiating lines like a sun, with smaller circles orbiting the center. Crawford had seen this symbol before in Etha's drawings. The giant had called it the mark of the first builders. Crawford reported this to Warden Merrick. Merrick ordered the cell sealed immediately. He told Crawford that no prisoner had ever been held there. That Crawford had been working the solitary wing, which had been empty for weeks. That if Crawford spoke about this to anyone, he would be charged with filing a false report and dismissed. Crawford knew he was being threatened, but he also knew what he had seen. He went home, retrieved his journal, and buried it in a metal box beneath the floorboards of his house. He told Emily that if anything happened to him, she was to keep the journal safe and never show it to authorities. 3 days later, Samuel Crawford walked into the Portland harbor and drowned himself. The official report listed it as an accidental death. His sister knew better. She kept the journal hidden for the rest of her life. When she died in 1954, Hannah, her daughter, found the box and read the entries. She tried to publish them in 1960. Every publisher rejected the manuscript. She tried again in 1972. Same result. The journal currently sits in the private collection of a historian in Vermont who refuses to be named. I've seen photographs of the pages. The handwriting is clear. The dates are consistent. And the descriptions match architectural anomalies that researchers have documented across the United States for the past 50 years. But here's where the story gets darker. Because Crawford wasn't the only guard to interact with Etha during those 26 days. There were 4 others on the rotation, and their fates tell us just how far someone was willing to go to keep this quiet. Guard number 2 was a man named Patrick Sullivan, Irish immigrant, aged 31, married with 2 children. He worked the evening shift, 6:00 to midnight. Sullivan never kept a journal, but his widow told her church group years later that Patrick came home one night in April of 1882, babbling about a man who could bend the bars of his cell, but chose not to. She said Patrick became obsessed with old books about mythology and lost civilizations. He started visiting the Portland Public Library every day, pulling volumes about ancient builders and megalithic structures. On May 2, 1882, less than a month after the giant's disappearance, Patrick Sullivan died in a construction accident. A load of bricks fell from a scaffold and crushed him. The foreman said it was a freak occurrence. The ropes were new. The scaffold had been inspected. But somehow the entire load came loose at the exact moment Sullivan walked beneath it. His widow found drawings hidden in his coat pocket. Sketches of massive stone columns and archways. Designs that she said looked like something from a cathedral but older, rougher. She burned them after the funeral because they frightened her. Guard number 3 was a man named William Hodge, age 28, former Union soldier. He worked the overnight shifts opposite Crawford. Hodge was known for being tough, unsentimental, the kind of man who didn't believe in anything he couldn't see or punch. But after his assignment to the basement cells, Hodge started drinking heavily. His supervisor noted that Hodge showed up to work smelling like whiskey and muttering about men who weren't men, about buildings that didn't match the stories we told ourselves. Hodge was found dead in his boarding house on June 14, 1882. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. He was 28 years old with no prior health issues. His landlord said Hodge had been pacing his room for hours the night before, arguing with someone who wasn't there. The landlord also said that Hodge had carved something into the wooden floor beside his bed. A symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward. The landlord sanded it down before the next tenant moved in. Guard number 4 was Thomas Brennan, age 35. He had worked at the jail for 8 years and was being considered for a promotion to deputy warden. Brennan worked the afternoon shifts and rarely interacted with prisoners directly. But after the Giants' arrival, Warden Merrick assigned him to deliver meals twice a day. Brennan's wife later told investigators that her husband became withdrawn and paranoid. He started locking the doors and windows at night. He stopped going to church. He kept asking her if she noticed anything strange about the buildings in town, if she ever wondered why certain structures had foundations that went deeper than they should. On July 30th, 1882, Thomas Brennan shot himself in the head. His suicide note said only if they built everything, we built nothing. The fifth guard was a young man named Carl Jensen, age 24. He had been hired just 2 months before the Giants' arrival and was the least experienced of the rotation. Jensen worked the early morning shifts, 400 to 800. He barely spent any time near the cell, usually just checking the corridor and moving on. But even that limited exposure was enough. Jensen quit the jail on August 3, 1882, without explanation. He moved to Boston and took a job as a factory worker. He never spoke about his time at the jail to anyone, including his own family. But in 1910, 28 years later, Jensen wrote a letter to the Portland Historical Society. The letter described a prisoner he had seen in the Cumberland County Jail who was impossibly tall and who spoke a language that sounded like rocks grinding together. Jensen said he had nightmares about that prisoner for decades. That every time he saw a large building, a church, a train station, anything with stone foundations, he wondered if something had been buried beneath it. Jensen died in 1911 from pneumonia. The letter was filed away and forgotten until a researcher found it in 2003 while cataloging old correspondence. 5 guards, 5 deaths or breakdowns within 6 months. The odds of that happening by chance are statistically impossible. Someone wanted those men silenced, and whoever that someone was had resources, reach, and a reason to keep the Giants' existence a secret. So, who was Etha and why was he in that cell? To answer that, we need to talk about something that mainstream historians refuse to acknowledge. The architectural anomalies scattered across North America that predate European colonization by centuries. Structures that were already ruins when the first settlers arrived. Structures that were deliberately buried, paved over, or destroyed. In the 1880s, newspapers across the United States published dozens of reports about giant skeletons being unearthed during construction projects. The New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Chicago Tribune, all of them ran stories about bones measuring 7 to 10 feet in length found in burial mounds, caves, and excavation sites. These weren't tabloid papers. These were reputable publications. But by 1900, those stories stopped. The skeletons disappeared. The Smithsonian Institution, which had been collecting these remains, issued statements saying the reports were exaggerated or misidentified. Modern archaeologists dismiss the entire phenomenon as a hoax or misunderstanding. And yet the reports exist. Hundreds of them, documented by engineers, doctors, and local officials who had no reason to lie. Crawford's journal mentioned something Etha told him during their conversations. That his people had been here for thousands of years, before the current civilization arrived. That they had built cities that reached into the sky and tunnels that stretched beneath the earth. That they had mastered stonework, metallurgy, and engineering techniques that the newcomers would take centuries to rediscover. Etha said his people were not conquerors. They were builders, keepers. They created structures meant to last forever, encoded with knowledge that future generations were supposed to inherit. But something happened. A collapse, a war, a catastrophe that Etha wouldn't or couldn't explain. His people scattered. Their cities were abandoned. And over time, the new inhabitants moved in, built on top of the ruins, and rewrote the history to exclude what came before. Crawford asked Etha why his people didn't fight back. Why they didn't reclaim what was theirs. Etha's answer, as Crawford recorded it, was chilling. We are few, you are many, and you have forgotten how to see what is in front of you. Etha told Crawford that the very jail he was imprisoned in had been built using stones taken from an older structure. That if Crawford looked closely at the foundation, he would find carvings and tool marks that didn't match 19th century techniques. Crawford did look, and he found them. Precision cuts in granite blocks, interlocking patterns that required no mortar. Edges so smooth they could have been polished by machine. He showed his findings to Warden Merrick. Merrick told him to stop digging into the building's history and focus on his job. The map that Etha drew for Crawford showed locations across the country where similar structures existed. Boston, where Etha had been captured. New York City, where the bedrock beneath Manhattan showed evidence of quarrying that predated the Dutch colony by 1,000 years. Philadelphia, where workers building the subway system in the 1900s found stone chambers 30 feet below street level that had no modern entrance or purpose. Crawford wrote that Etha had been searching for something in Boston. An object or a record that belonged to his people. Something that had been taken and hidden inside a building that was erected over one of their old sites. Etha never said what it was, but he said that without it, his people's history would be lost forever. Etha was captured by federal agents who were waiting for him. It wasn't random. They knew he was coming, which means someone had been tracking him, studying him, watching his people for long enough to predict their movements. The question is, who and why? In 1885, 3 years after Etha's disappearance, the United States government established the Bureau of American Ethnology under the Smithsonian Institution. The stated purpose was to study Native American cultures and preserve their histories. But the Bureau also had a secondary, less publicized mandate to investigate and catalog archaeological anomalies that didn't fit the accepted historical narrative. Between 1885 and 1920, the Bureau sent teams across the country to excavate burial mounds, examine ancient ruins, and collect any physical evidence of pre-Columbian advanced civilizations. Thousands of artifacts were gathered: skeletons, tools, inscriptions, architectural fragments. Most of these items were logged into Smithsonian records, but a significant number were not. They simply disappeared into storage and were never seen again. Researchers who have tried to access these records have been told that the items were lost, destroyed, or mislabeled. In some cases, entire catalog sections are missing. Archives that should contain decades of research are empty or heavily redacted. One researcher, a man named Richard Duforst, spent years compiling newspaper reports about giant skeletons and trying to cross-reference them with Smithsonian records. He found over 400 documented cases of giant remains being discovered in the 1800s. Of those 400, the Smithsonian has records for fewer than 20, and of those 20, None of the physical remains still exist. Dewhurst published his findings in May 2013. The Smithsonian issued a statement dismissing his work as conspiracy theory. They did not, however, release the missing archives. So what does this have to do with Etha? Crawford's journal contains a detail that most people overlook. He wrote that during one of their conversations, Etha told him that his people had tried to coexist with the newcomers, that they had offered knowledge, shared techniques, and attempted to preserve the structures and history that existed before. But the newcomers didn't want to share. They wanted to own, and ownership required erasing what came before. Etha said that agents of the new government had been systematically destroying evidence of his people's existence since the early 1800s. Burning records, sealing ruins, rewriting land surveys to exclude structures that didn't fit the narrative. He said the capture and imprisonment of his kind wasn't about justice or safety. It was about control, about making sure the true history stayed buried. Crawford asked Etha what would happen if the truth came out, if people knew that the cities they lived in were built on top of older, greater civilizations. Etha's response was, they would have to admit they are not the first. And that is something your leaders will never allow. The federal marshals who delivered Etha to the jail in 1882 worked for an agency that no longer exists in official records. Crawford wrote that their uniforms had no insignia, that they refused to identify their department or provide documentation, that when Warden Merrick pressed them for information, they simply said they were acting on orders from Washington, and that further questions would be considered obstruction. After Etha's disappearance, those same marshals returned to the jail. They confiscated all records related to the prisoner. They interviewed each of the 5 guards individually and made it clear that discussing the case with anyone would result in federal charges. They ordered the cell sealed and told Merrick that if anyone asked, the prisoner had never existed. Merrick complied. He had no choice. But his personal diary, discovered in an estate sale in 1987, tells a different story. Merrick wrote that the marshals threatened him directly, that they told him the jail's funding depended on his cooperation, that they implied his family's safety was at risk if he spoke out. Merrick also wrote that one of the marshals let something slip during the interrogation. He said the prisoner wasn't the first of his kind they had dealt with, that there were facilities in other states holding similar individuals, that the federal government had been managing this problem for decades. Merrick asked what the problem was. The marshal refused to answer. But he did say one thing that Merrick recorded verbatim, people knew what was under their feet. They'd stop believing in progress. And that would be the end of everything we've built. Crawford never got to share what he learned. The other guards never got to speak. Warden Merrick took his knowledge to the grave, and Etha vanished into whatever system was set up to contain him and his people. But the evidence didn't vanish with them. In 1903, workers renovating the Cumberland County Jail broke through a sealed section of the basement. They found the cell where Etha had been held. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols and diagrams that the workers couldn't identify. The 4 men called in an archaeologist from the local university. The archaeologist spent 2 hours examining the carvings before declaring them modern graffiti and leaving. But one of the workers took photographs. Those photographs still exist. They show intricate geometric patterns, star charts, and what appear to be architectural blueprints for structures that no one in 1903 would have known how to build. The photographs were published in a regional history journal in 1978. The journal folded 6 months later. In 1955, A construction crew digging the foundation for a new office building in Boston uncovered a stone chamber 20 feet below street level. The chamber was empty, but the walls showed tool marks consistent with pre-industrial quarrying techniques. The stones were massive, perfectly fitted with no mortar. The city ordered the site filled in and paved over within 48 hours. No archaeological survey was conducted. No records were filed. A surveyor on that crew wrote a letter to his brother describing what he saw. He said the chamber looked like it had been built for someone much larger than a normal person, that the doorway was over 10 feet tall, and the ceiling was 15 feet high. He said the whole thing gave him a feeling of dread, like he was trespassing in a tomb. That letter is now part of the Boston Public Library's manuscript collection, filed under local folklore. In 1972, a historian researching land records in Philadelphia found a reference to a stone structure discovered during the excavation of City Hall in 1871. The structure was described as a circular chamber, made of granite blocks with inscriptions that resembled no known language. The city's chief engineer recommended further study. His recommendation was overruled by the mayor's office, which ordered the structure demolished and the site cleared. The historian tried to find the engineer's original report. It had been removed from the archives. When she asked why, she was told the file had been transferred to federal custody in 1920 and never returned. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern, a deliberate, systematic effort to erase evidence of a pre-Columbian advanced civilization in North America. And the key to that erasure was making sure people like Etha never had the chance to tell their story. Samuel Crawford's journal ends with an entry dated April 10, 1882, the day after Etha's disappearance. Crawford wrote that he no longer knew what to believe, that everything he had been taught about history, progress, and civilization felt like a lie. He wrote that Etha had shown him a world that existed before the one he knew, a world that was greater, older, and deliberately forgotten. Crawford's final words in the journal are, if they erased his people, what stops them from erasing us? 3 days later, he was dead. The official story is that there was no giant, that Crawford and the other guards were suffering from shared delusion or mass hysteria, that the carvings in the cell were vandalism, that the newspaper reports about skeletons were exaggerations, that the sealed ruins and destroyed records are just bureaucratic inefficiency. But if that's true, why did 5 men die? Why were the records confiscated? Why was the cell sealed so quickly? And why do the architectural anomalies keep appearing no matter how many times they're buried? The truth is, we're living on top of someone else's history, walking through cities built over the bones of a civilization that we've been trained to ignore. And every time someone like Etha tries to reclaim what was taken, the system steps in to make sure the story stays buried. Samuel Crawford died trying to tell the truth. So did Patrick Sullivan, William Hodge, Thomas Brennan, and Carl Jensen. Their deaths weren't accidents. They were warnings. A message that some knowledge is too dangerous to survive. But here's the thing about buried truths. They don't stay buried forever. They leak. They resurface. And eventually, someone digs deep enough to find them. Crawford's journal survived. The photographs survived. The letters survived. And now you know the story. The question is, what are you going to do with it? If you found this story compelling, there's more to uncover. Click the video on screen. And if you're the kind of person who wants to dig deeper into the history they don't teach in school, subscribe. Because this is just the beginning.